Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Eve Runyon. I am the president and CEO of Pro Bono Institute. We have an exciting program for you here today as part of PBI's first ever virtual conference. Over the past couple of weeks, we have been hosting programming on everything from providing pro bono legal services during a pandemic to climate change, to the criminalization of poverty through driver's license suspension, and much more. Today, we have the pleasure of bringing to you an exciting keynote address and an impressive keynote speaker, Stacey Abrams. Stacey is a New York Times bestselling author, an entrepreneur, a nonprofit CEO, and a political leader. Stacey served for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as Democratic leader. In 2018, Stacey became the Democratic nominee for governor of the state of Georgia, winning more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. She was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States, and she was the first Black woman to deliver a response to the State of the Union. In 2018, Stacey launched Fair Fight, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in battleground states to ensure every American has a voice in our election system. Over the course of her career, Stacey has founded multiple organizations devoted to voter rights, training and hiring young people of color, and tackling social issues both at the state and national levels. I first met Stacey many years ago in law school. I consider Stacey a friend, and I am a huge fangirl. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Stacey Abrams.
Well, Eve, that friendship and fangirling is mutual. So thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the team at PBI for having me. I tend to introduce myself these days as Stacey Abrams, not the governor of Georgia. And that's particularly relevant in today's conversation because given the aftermath of the 2018 election, I had a lot of time on my hands. I spent 10 days between election day and my non-concession day thinking about the work that I wanted to do had I become governor, realizing that because my opponent in the election was the scorekeeper, the referee, and the contestant, and having the very numbing realization that he probably was going to win, I spent that 10 days fighting to make sure that every vote was counted, but I also spent that 10 days plotting, going through all the stages of grief and realizing that that wasn't enough, that I needed to think about how I would do the work if I didn't have the platform. And the work for me was very clear. It was that we had to reaffirm our commitment to democracy, especially in places like Georgia, where voter suppression was stealing the voices of thousands of people, where people who needed desperately to have access to Medicaid expansion, to climate action, to criminal justice reform, to smart immigration policies, the only kind that states can actually engage in when it comes to the 287G programs and decisions about how we were going to participate in this broken immigration system in our country. Each of those decisions would only be made based on who the governor was. I knew that their voices were being denied because their choices were denied. They were not permitted to cast their ballots. Some weren't even able to get on the rolls. Those who were tried to cast ballots and found their pathways closed. And those who made it through the hurdles found their votes rejected. And so in the aftermath of 2018, I knew I wanted to fight for fair elections. But I also understood that based on my experience becoming Democratic leader in 2010, in the wake of the 2010 census, I understood the importance of a census for the first time in 2011, when I watched the redistricting process summarily strip away opportunities for communities of color to organize and galvanize into coalition with other communities to elect representation that truly reflected their needs and their values. Because redistricting is governed by the 2020 census, because it had been governed by the 2010 census, I knew that I had to focus on how we would make sure that the legislatures, whether it is Congress, state legislatures, or the city councils, county commissions, and school boards, they're going to govern the next decade of our lives, that they truly reflect and truly understand the composition of America. And so I wanted to start an organization that focused on the census. and because I'm Southern. I was technically born in Wisconsin. I remember being cold and eating cheese curds, but for the rest of my life, I've been from the South. I grew up in Mississippi, came of age in Georgia, but I will always believe that the South is not only a space where good can happen. Unfortunately, we are the trendsetter when bad comes to call. And so I wanted to start an organization that thought about how we translated progressive policies into Southern, how we tackle these challenges that not only exist in the South, that exist around the country, but tend to go unanswered in the South. And so because I had 10 whole days, I created 3 new institutions. I created Fair Fight and its companion Fair Fight 2020, which is focusing, as Eve pointed out, on tackling the issue of voter suppression, not simply in Georgia, but across the country. I founded Fair Count, which began with a focus solely on Georgia, but has become a national organization because we're one of the few whose sole focus is the 2020 census, making sure that the hardest to count communities are being included in the story of America and that they get access to the resources necessary to make their dreams a reality. And I started the Southern Economic Advancement Project, an organization who just this week released the first paper of our organization's existence, looking at how we have the conversation about climate action in the South, because unfortunately this region is lagging behind, even though our populations are the most vulnerable and the least resilient to the challenges that climate change is bringing to the United States. I'm here today because the work we do on voting, on the census, on policy, these are challenges that I've been thinking about for a very long time, including during my time at Yale Law School with Eve. One of the reasons I thought the world of Eve was that she used that time at Yale to focus on how she could help the world, how she could help that community, and how she could think about tomorrow. And that's what I try to do every day. I grew up with parents who were teenagers in the civil rights movement, who were activists because they recognized that age did not exempt them from the obligations they had to shape the future they wanted, but also to serve those who were being denied their citizenship in our country because of Jim Crow. I watched my parents, when we were coming of age, they would take us with them to vote. And when we would ask why that was so important, my dad would remind us he was arrested at the age of 14 for registering Black people in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. We like to tease them that my mom was doing the same work, she just managed not to get caught. But what they wanted us to see was not simply the work of service, which they took us to. My parents would wake us up on Saturdays and we would go to soup kitchens and homeless shelters. We would volunteer in basically youth prisons. We would do the work of service, even though, as we would point out to my parents, we were poor too. We lived in that space, that gray space called the working class poor. We were in that space because there were not laws that protected my father, that protected my mother, that protected their ambition and said that they should have the same opportunities. Not guarantees of success, but opportunities to access those things. And so I grew up knowing that service was a part of who we are. When we would tell my parents, we're poor too, why are we doing this? Their response was, having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. But what they wanted us to understand is that it wasn't just about doing good for others. That wasn't why we did it. We did it because we were responsible for one another, whether it was for the 5 brothers and sisters that I have, or for the community I lived in, or the nation I call my home. They wanted us to know that our obligation was to provide service, because when you see a problem, your job is to fix it. But they also wanted us to understand that one of the tools for change was going to the voting booth. We would follow my parents in. We would trail out like make way for ducklings because there were way too many of us to fit behind those curtains. But they wanted us to not just hear about voting, they wanted us to see them in the act of casting that ballot, to understand that no matter what their economic situation, no matter the racism they face in their daily lives, that their democracy, that their country deserved to hear from them. And that's why they voted. And so I've been privileged for the last 46 years to be an American. And for the last 25 to put my shoulder to the grindstone, to constantly think about how we make being an American a reality for everyone, to make full citizenship real and possible. During most of my teenage years and during my early years working on the issue of voter engagement, my focus was voter expansion, because I lived under the protection of the Voting Rights Act. From the age of 18, I knew that I had the right to vote, and my job was to get as many of my colleagues to do so as well. It wasn't until 2013, however, that penumbra was stripped away, that protection was rolled back, and that my focus had to shift not simply to be about voter engagement, to be about voter protection, to be about fighting against voter suppression. But it was a skill that I learned not only in law school, but a skill I learned as a young lawyer. As a lawyer at Sutherland, Asbill and Brennan, when I first joined the firm, I was taken to task early on because I very strongly clutched the notion of pro bono work. I did not quite do the billable hours thing the way I was supposed to. And we had a few conversations with the partners about how my billable hours did not quite meet their expectations. But I got praise for the fact that I was doing some work on the side, some pro bono work. And one of my most important pro bono activities was working on a campaign and being able to sit in the room when they had to count absentee ballots and review ballots because of a close election. Being the person who was in the room, who was armed with the knowledge of the law to know what was possible, meant everything to me. It meant that the woman I supported became the mayor of Atlanta, but more importantly, it meant that people in Atlanta had their votes protected. And I'm here today because I want everyone under the sound of my voice to know that you have the power to shape the 2020 elections. Pro bono attorneys can be so instrumental because you have spent your careers understanding those who feel distanced from and isolated from power, who see themselves not simply as disadvantaged, but as cut off from opportunity. In this upcoming election, we have the responsibility to ensure that every voice is heard and every vote is counted. But we cannot do that if we don't understand the contours of voter suppression. Because while it may have different iterations depending on the state you live in, the mechanics, the architecture are always the same. It's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you access a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? We know that in state after state, more and more hurdles have been put in place to block voter registration itself. While we have some states that have done the wonderful work of automatic registration, too many states rely on the US's unfortunate posture of saying it's up to each individual to know the rules, know the laws of 50 states, and get themselves on the rolls. In almost every other industrialized, democratized nation, voter registration is automatic, and it's the responsibility of the government because it is a practical perquisite of citizenship. But the United States has, from its inception, made it hard to access the power of the right to vote. And so we need folks who understand wherever you live, who understand the rules of voter registration, to make certain that those who want to get on the rolls have the ability to not only get on the rolls, but stay on the rolls. You've watched, as I have across this country, as voter purges have taken on a new urgency for those who want to strip the rolls of people they don't think belong. I agree that dead people shouldn't vote. And I agree that if you don't live in a community, you shouldn't speak for that community. But that does not account for every person who is taken off the rolls. And we know in Georgia, in Florida, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, across the country, there are attempts to strip people of their right to vote, to preclude them from ever beginning the opportunity of citizenship in that way. And so we need pro bono attorneys who are working with and willing to be called on to help protect those who need to get on the rolls and stay on the rolls. But the second issue is, can you cast a ballot? And if you've watched, as I have with horror, as what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in Georgia, what happened in Texas, what happened in Kentucky, these are not isolated incidents. What happened in New York, what came unfortunately to fruition in Pennsylvania, the long lines in Maryland. This is because we have people who are doing their best to impede the right to vote. Some, it's benign, and that benign is the fact that they don't have the resources or the training to scale elections appropriately at this moment. But for others, it is malevolent. It is an intentional interference in the right to vote. And we need attorneys who are ready to help fight back. In 2018, as I stood for governor, I went to go and cast my ballot. When I got to the polling station, I went to an early voting polling station to tell folks early voting's good. I get up to the front and I get ready to get my ballot, and they tell me I can't have one because I've already voted absentee. I lean into the young woman who looks terrified because behind me are dozens of cameras from CNN and MSNBC and Fox and ABC, and I think BBC was there. So she's looking at the cameras and telling me that I can't vote for myself for governor. I lean in and I whisper to her, we have a quiet conversation, And I urged her to go get her manager so we can get this figured out. Because you see, I had the privilege of knowing how the law works. I had the privilege of being an attorney who understood what my rights were. And when that poll manager showed up, we had a conversation of power to power, where we were able to resolve my issue and get me my ballot. And it didn't hurt that there was international pressure to get it done. But the reality is, I had privilege that day. I have a privilege that millions of Americans will not enjoy, because they, for the first time, believe that their right to vote is real. For the first time, they've gotten on these rolls. For the first time in years, they're going to try to cast a ballot, and there are going to be those who try to stop them. We need your help. We need you to sign up with your state parties, with your organizations. Sign up to be on call on those days when voters are going to be desperate to know what their rights are, but they're not going to know who has the answer. You will. We need attorneys who are willing to do the work of being present. And if you're willing to go a step further, we need you to be poll workers, people who are inside, who understand what's happening, are willing to give your time and your talent as you do every day. But in this case, to do it, to make certain that the right to vote is made real for those who desperately need it to come to fruition this time. The issues that we face in elections are not only can you register and stay on the rolls and can you cast your ballot, but it's can your ballot be counted? And we know that across this country, we are going to have unprecedented challenges to who had the right to vote. We know, for example, that the Republican National Committee has announced its intention to monitor polling places. They've announced their intention to question and challenge voters. And if that is your party, I urge you to make certain that they are doing the right thing and they are not doing something that is malicious. And if you are on any other side of the aisle, we need you to be there to protect voters, to make sure they have the information they need. Because our democracy is not partisan. The selections we make are, but the process itself should not be. We watched in Georgia as 20 different counties had to seek judicial authority to extend their elections. And they had to do so not because it was a Democratic county or a Republican county, but because the machinery of democracy was broken. And no matter who you target, if it breaks for everyone, then democracy doesn't work. You can be part of the solution by signing up and being ready to be part of a volunteer army of attorneys who are ready to go into communities where the right to vote may not be real without you. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? That is the work that you can do. And as one of your legion, although I never did it professionally, I convinced them to let me do some pro bono work on my own. I've always understood how incredibly critical your work is, that you stand in the gap for those who do not know how to solve their problems in other ways. You are willing to be those who are shields protecting those facing a sword of discrimination, the swords that would strike down their citizenship rights, their human rights. You are the ones who can help make this year better, who can make the answers and the solutions we seek real. And so I'm here to ask you, to call on you, to once again lean in and deliver all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacey. That was fantastic. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your perspective, your wisdom, and speaking to us about this extremely important issue. We do have a little bit of time for question and answer, and so I'm going to open up the program to Q&A and encourage our attendees to use the prompt that is on your screen to submit questions. We do have a limited amount of time, and so we may not get to everyone's question, and we also had some questions that were submitted in advance. And so I'm going to start with one of the questions that was submitted in advance. And I know in 2018, part of what Fair Fight did is file suit. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening with regard to litigation?
Sure. So we filed suit in 2019. So we announced the creation and the intent to file in 2018. We filed our lawsuit along with a number of declarations, hundreds of declarations actually, in 2019. We are at the tail end of discovery and moving towards the next phase of the litigation. As you may imagine, things were put on hold when COVID really took hold here in Georgia. And unfortunately, Georgia was one of the states ravaged hardest by COVID-19. But we are now back on track, and we are waiting for the judge to set the trial order.
Excellent. Now, considering what's been happening around the country the past few weeks and the focus on racial justice as a whole and what that means for us, not just in the US, but around the globe, do you think it's important to frame voting rights in terms of racial justice?
Absolutely. Not only voting rights, but the census. And that's, as I mentioned, the two organizations for me that are most critical and urgent in this moment are Fair Fight, because we're fighting for the right to vote, and Fair Count, because it's how we not only allocate economic power, but political power. And the way I want folks to think about it is that the policies that are being demanded, rightfully so, the issues that racial injustice allow to foment, those can only be changed by electing representatives who shape the policies, because we live in a democracy, and that right to vote is directly related to how racial justice is made real. But the census is how we allocate the political districts for who gets to be heard. And we know that there has been a very strong intent to homogenize the 2020 census, to push out communities of color, to make certain that when the maps are drawn, they do not reflect the racial composition of communities. Because as everyone on this call likely knows, because partisan gerrymandering is now legal, the only legal prohibition against gerrymandering is racial gerrymandering, an issue you don't have to worry about if people of color aren't counted. And because there is no do-over for the census, if people in the census are not counted in 2020, if people of color are excised from the story of America, they are losing both economic and political power. The economic power to shape how our budgets actually build our communities, but also the political power to elect representatives who can be held accountable for actually building policies, racial equity policies that serve us all.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about absentee ballots and mail-in ballots in light of the pandemic. What's the best way to fight the rhetoric around mail-in voting, and that mail-in voting leads to fraud?
So first of all, it's to know the facts. The Heritage Foundation is the most aggressive purveyor of this myth other than Donald Trump. And so I use their own numbers. According to the Heritage Foundation, there have been 1,300 examples of voter fraud writ large. So that includes mail, in-person, voting when you weren't supposed to, any type of fraud as they like to categorize it. They've enumerated 1,300 since 2000. So being really generous and only counting the federal elections that have occurred since 2000, although they pick up elections that are municipal or county or state, if you only count that, it's 1,300 cases of putative voter fraud out of 625 million votes cast. So at best, it is de minimis, but to be honest, it is mythological. Voter fraud is not an issue in America. We don't have a problem with people trying to vote too many times. We've got a problem with people voting. And they then throw up the specter of what happened in North Carolina in 2017 or what happened in Mississippi in 2006. And I would point to both of those as being election fraud. Voters weren't doing anything that they weren't supposed to. There were bad actors who interceded and tried to take advantage of their right to vote. So we have to first begin by denouncing the existence of voter fraud as a real issue. Number two, we have to recognize why they're raising it. Donald Trump told the truth for once when he said that he did not believe he could win an election if every American voter could cast their ballot. I don't know if he's right, but I'd like to test it out. And so we need to understand that Donald Trump votes by mail, that his family votes by mail, that his cabinet votes by mail, that his staff votes by mail, and there should be no distinction between what the president is allowed to do as a member of our democracy and what the janitor who cleans the White House should be permitted to do. Voting by mail is the safest, most accessible way that we can make voting available to all. And this is the last thing I'll say about it. We have to think about vote by mail as not just about casting a ballot, but it's about making sure we get people out of line so that those who have no choice but to be in line can cast their ballots. And in the United States, if you are disabled, if you are homeless, if you've been displaced by COVID, if you have a language barrier, or if voting by mail didn't work for you, being able to stand in that line 6 feet apart, and use clean machines can only be made real if we get as many people out of line as possible. And that's why we need the HEROES Act, which will fund the scaling of our elections in a way that permits those who can to vote by mail and those who can't to safely vote in person.
Fantastic, thank you. We have another question submitted by one of our participants. And can you speak to the current uprising around racial justice issues and how we as attorneys can best target our energies around dismantling racist systems and institutions?
When Eve introduced the work that you do and the conversations you've been having, everything you do where you are serving community, particularly communities of color, interceding in moments of injustice, you are part of dismantling the system. You can run for office. Having policymakers who understand both the law and the urgency of the issue is a critical space to occupy. You can support candidates running, but you can also hold people accountable. You occupy a very unique rung in society where you know not only what the laws are, but you know what wrong is, and you've seen it in action. And we keep thinking about this moment of transformation where there will be this clarion call and suddenly race, and I know no one is this naive, but we sort of envision it as this moment where the structures of evil come down and right is raised up. That's not how it's going to happen. Racism is a disease. It is a cancer, and it metastasizes. And our only ability to interfere with it is to build a superstructure that is able to at least contain it and eventually crush it. But we have to know that that is going to be centuries in the making, because this has been centuries in the creation. And some of it, unfortunately, is embedded in how our nation exists. But we can do the work of calling it out where we see it, challenging laws that rely on it, especially when those laws seem benign on their face or facially neutral, and we know there is a racist intent or at least racist application. And as attorneys, going on the record, raising these concerns. You see clients, you work with organizations that know these things to be true, talk about it. Write letters to the editor that expose these concerns. Make certain that you are working with folks who understand, and do not assume that any legal issue that you address, that there is a corollary person in some position of political power who understands it. Make sure that you're the educators, because you're going to encounter examples that for the average state legislator or city council member, where many of these things actually come to fruition, you're going to have information they never will. Most of these are folks who are worried about 15 things, and not one of those things is a thing that you know. And so make sure you're part of educating, advocating, and then agitating if they do nothing about it. Those are the ways we can start to dismantle the system, because we have to remember systems are not just laws on the books. They're the people who write them, who execute them, who enforce them, and who adjudicate them. We have to make certain we're tackling all parts of that system if we want to dismantle the rigorous nature of racism.
In addition to sort of focusing on November and elections and voter suppression, which is certainly front of mind, the nation and the globe is focused on issues of police reform and criminal justice reform. And we yesterday were fortunate to have Attorney General Keith Ellison join us and talk about what's happening in Minnesota and more broadly about police reform and criminal justice reform. Based on the work that you've done throughout your career, do you have some perspective on what we potentially could do as pro bono lawyers, as people interested in this issue, interested in racial equity, that a help would move those issues forward in a way that's productive and safe for communities?
Certainly. During my tenure as leader in the House, as Democratic leader, I worked very closely with our Republican governor on criminal justice issues, on criminal justice reform. We did everything from making certain that in the state of Georgia, when you had served your time, that you could apply for an occupational license. This was an issue that very few people were aware of. I wasn't aware of it until I dug in. I didn't realize that you could study and train for 10 years in a state prison, but the minute you got out, you could not use your newly found skills because you were permanently prohibited from holding an occupational license in the state of Georgia. Often the changes that we need to make, while there are macro changes that are absolutely necessary, there are micro impediments that are so devastating that they block criminal justice reform from being real. So first, think about who you know, who you've engaged with, or what you understand of the law, and make certain that we are paying attention to how that law may interfere with a returning citizen's ability to fully re-enter. When it comes to issues of police brutality, we often elide the very basic issues. We may not recognize that a person who's harassed over and over again in a certain community, it may not look like police brutality, but when you cannot enjoy your community, you cannot enjoy your home, that should be raised. And it's not just something to talk about with each other, it's something to report to the mayor who oversees the chief of police. Report it to the chief of police. If you have a citizens review board, make certain they know about it. But part of what attorneys have is they have a credibility that so many other citizens lack when these conversations happen. And you have access to information because you are embedded in the system. And so use that information and use that access to lift up these issues. There are going to be lots of macro opportunities that we are going to see that are going to have to happen from the state legislative level or the federal level. But one place I worry we push aside so easily is that local action is actually what hurts people the most. I am all for the passage of the Justice and Policing Act through Congress, but I am even more driven to make certain that we pass a law that disallows citizens arrest and stand your ground in the state of Georgia, that we disallow the use of chokeholds. And so look for the local examples of police brutality, look for the local examples of injustice in the system. Those are the ones to focus on because that touches more people every day. And that's the space where so often we are looking so far ahead and so far up that we forget that most of the ruin is at our feet.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm very mindful of the time, and I know you were generous and gave us an extra 3 minutes, and so we only have 1 more minute before you have to sign off. You talked a lot about what pro bono lawyers can do specifically as it relates to voting and voter suppression. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, an ask that you have for this community?
So I have one ask and one plug, and I'm only making the plug because it helps you to do the ask. So I recently wrote a book called Our Time Is Now, Power, Purpose, and the Fight for a Fair America. And in the book, I really lay out what voter suppression looks like in reality, what the census means for America, why identity matters in our politics, and what the playbook is so that we can actually start to fix these things so that average people and above average people and those who don't know where they fit on the litmus test so that they can do the work. And so check out the book because it gives you more than I can give you in 30 minutes. But we really need pro bono attorneys to sign up. Please sign up with Fair Fight Action. We need pro bono attorneys in every state in this country. We especially need them in the battleground states where we're going to decide not only the presidency and the Senate, but states as they flip. If we need to pick up state houses to make sure that we have fair redistricting, this will only happen if we have people who are willing to stand with us. This is going to be the most litigious election in modern history. Because of COVID-19, because people recognize that in 34 states they have the right to absentee ballots, and in 16 states they can use them, but only if they have an excuse, we're going to have fight after fight after fight over who can vote, whether their vote counts, and whether their voice counts. We need you to sign up to be pro bono attorneys for us. So please, please, please go to fairfightaction.com, or you can directly email Liza at fairfightaction.com. Sign up. We need a pro bono attorney army, and we need to be ready to protect the right to vote across this country. Even if you live in Nirvana, like Oregon, where they do great with voting, we still need you because we need everyone everywhere, because this is going to be a battle, not just for the soul of America, but for the future of our democracy. So thank you for having me. Sign up. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Stacey. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We will share more information about the fight and addressing voter suppression issues. So be on the lookout for a follow-up email. Stacey, you are fantastic. It is a joy seeing you. I wish it could actually be in person, but this will do for now.
And best of luck to you. Thank you, all of the attendees who participated today. And we look forward to seeing you at other sessions throughout PBI's virtual conference. Have a fantastic day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Eve. Take
Bye.
care.